That day was supposed to be like any other day of war. The sun blazed hot, pressing down on the borderland. Between Lydia and Media, two massive armies stood face to face. Horses neighed, banners rippled in the dry wind, and spears glittered beneath the harsh midday light. The air carried the scent of dust and blood yet to be spilled. King Alyats of Lydia and King Cyaxares of Media had sworn, no retreat, no negotiation, only one would stand victorious. But as the war drums thundered, something impossible happened. The sunlight began to fade slowly, like a curtain being drawn across the sky. A shadow crept from the horizon, swallowing the bright blue into heavy darkness. The shouts of soldiers froze, spears lowered, horses reared in panic. Temple priests screamed of divine wrath. In an instant, the battlefield transformed into a sea of confusion and fear. In the midst of that chaos, there was one man who did not tremble. He was not a king, not a general. He was a philosopher from the harbor city of Miletus, Thales. To Thales, this was no curse from the heavens. He had calculated it months earlier. He knew when the eclipse would come. He knew the sun would vanish. He knew the world would hold its breath. While kings wondered about the will of the gods, Thales stood calmly because he trusted his calculations. When two kingdoms froze in terror, one scientific prediction changed the course of history. The eclipse was not merely a natural phenomenon. It was an invisible blade that severed the war before blood was shed. Months before the eclipse, tensions between Lydia and Media had already been rising. Their borderlands were rich in resources and controlled critical trade routes. Every caravan that passed through could tip the balance of power over eastern commerce. Both kingdoms were strong, neither would yield. When their armies finally met, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sun burned bright, metal weapons shimmered in the heat, and the roars of soldiers filled the air. Temple priests called upon the war gods. In the minds of the kings, there was only one thought: victory. But the sky had a different plan. The shadow that came that day was not the result of military strategy, but of the cosmic clockwork. Slowly, sunlight dimmed. The scorching heat turned cold, as if something was sucking the life out of day itself. Soldiers panicked. They stopped looking at the enemy and started looking at the sky. There was no victor on that battlefield, not because the armies were equally matched, but because they were equally afraid. Two powerful kings, who had spent months planning strategies and commanding thousands, were reduced to mere mortals before a darkened sky. Spears halted, horses stilled, the battlefield froze. And amid that collective fear, one name whispered among royal advisors: Thales of Miletus. The strange man from a harbor town who spent his nights staring at the stars. The only one who knew this eclipse was not a coincidence. Years before the war, Thales had been doing something incomprehensible to most people of his time. Observing the night sky, he recorded the rising and setting of stars, measured the length of shadows, and compared his notes to Babylonian astronomical tables obtained from Phoenician sailors. People laughed at him. "Why watch the sky?" they said. "The sky belongs to the gods." But Thales thought differently. To him, the sky was not a place of mystery, but a place of hidden patterns. He watched how the moon crossed the heavens, how the sun shifted gradually with the seasons. He discovered something repeating, cycles. From that, his conviction was born. If the sky has patterns, eclipses can be predicted. While kings counted soldiers, Thales counted solar paths. While temple priests waited for divine messages, he drew calculations on wax tablets. And as the day of war approached, he already knew daylight would turn into night in the midst of battle. When the eclipse actually happened, Thales was not surprised. He did not kneel. He simply watched as his mathematical prediction took hold of a moment even kings could not control. In the ancient world, the sky was the realm of gods. An eclipse was a message from above, a warning, wrath, or omen. No human dared challenge it. But on that day, in the middle of thousands of terrified soldiers from Lydia and Media, one man stood firm: Thales. Temple priests screamed. Soldiers fell to their knees. Generals lost command. The sky turned black as night, though it was midday. But Thales knew exactly what it was: a total solar eclipse, something he had calculated through time and distance. While others bowed to the gods, Thales bowed to logic. He watched clearly as the moon's shadow passed over the sun. No curse, no miracle, just nature following its laws. This moment marked a profound reversal. The faith of kings and commoners in divine signs faltered. For the first time in the history of war, the calmest person on the field was not a priest, but a scientist. And that calm was the sharpest weapon that day. King Alyats of Lydia was a hard ruler, used to conquering cities by sword and horse. To him, Victory was earned through strength, not the words of a foreigner. But after the eclipse, the king's face changed. He no longer looked at the battlefield, and he looked at the sky, and at the man who had known what was coming before anyone else. Thales was summoned to the royal tent. The torches flickered dimly. The king stared at him and asked, "You knew this would happen?" Thales did not kneel. He simply answered, "I read it in the sky." A statement that, to a warrior king, sounded insane, but undeniable. No army could darken the sun. No king could halt daylight. But Thales had done it, not with magic, but with knowledge. That night, history shifted. The king of Lydia did not bow to his enemy, but to understanding. From that moment on, Thales was no longer just a philosopher from a harbor town. He was the man kings listened to. Many would later call it prophecy. But Thales despised that word. He was not a prophet. He was a reader of the heavens. He combined Babylonian records, Phoenician navigation, and Ionian geometry to predict the moment the moon would cover the sun. All without telescopes, compasses, or modern tools. Only logic, geometry, and insatiable curiosity. Where priests saw divine wrath, Thales saw orbital alignment. He understood that an eclipse was not a miracle, but a natural event with a pattern that could be read, calculated, and explained. With one elegant calculation, he defeated the collective fear of two great kingdoms. No army could have done that, only an idea. History remembers wars won with blood. But that day, the war between Lydia and Media was ended by science, not by diplomacy, not by secret weapons, but by a perfectly timed shadow. The eclipse forced two stubborn kings to sit and make peace, not out of compassion, but because they realized there was a power greater than the sword. And that power did not belong solely to the gods, but to the man who understood the heavens. This was one of the rarest moments in human history. A great war stopped by a single scientist. Thales' name was written down, not as a general, but as the mind behind the sky. Centuries later, Herodotus, the father of history, recorded this story, not because of the might of Lydia's army, nor Media's valor, but because of one name that turned the sky into a tool of peace: Thales. At that time, it was almost unthinkable for a philosopher to be remembered above kings. But Thales transcended boundaries. He proved that an idea can be sharper than a sword and greater than a throne. From a single eclipse calculation, the world recognized a pioneer. Knowledge can change history. After that day, many began to look at the sky differently. It was no longer just a realm of prayer and fear. It became a realm that could be understood. Thales sparked a small but monumental shift. People began to believe that natural phenomena could be explained, not only worshipped. What was once seen as divine signs became the first objects of science in Western history. From that eclipse, the seed of rational thought sprouted. From a philosopher of a small harbor city, the world learned knowledge can conquer mystery. People once believed destiny was determined by the gods, unchangeable, unknowable. But Thales proved something stronger. Destiny could be understood. He did not change the sky, but he knew when it would change. And that knowledge reshaped the world below. The war stopped. Kings bowed. Soldiers trembled. But one man stood tall, and a philosopher, not a warrior. A stargazer, not a ruler. Thales did not just predict an eclipse. He reversed the way the world saw fate. The eclipse passed, the sun returned. But from that day on, the name Thales never dimmed. He became a symbol. One sharp mind can defeat 1,000 swords.